My name is Andre Joseph Witzig, and I'm just going to speak with you about my efforts to advance coastal zone management in Grenada using ecosystem services and new technologies to inform climate resilient coastal zone management. And this is just an aerial snapshot of one of the indented coasts of Grenada, where you can see multiple ecosystems from mangroves, coral reefs, seagrass beds, and even offshore barrier islands as well. For people who might not know, Grenada is at the south of the Caribbean archipelago, right above Trinidad and Venezuela, and is actually made up of three islands. We have mainland Grenada, we have the smaller islands of Carriacou, and then even smaller than that is Petit Martinique. We have about 100,000 people. Grenada is a volcanic island with about 133 square miles and 121 kilometers of coastline. Coming into the CSP program, my past in Grenada was as a coastal zone coastal resources officer, working with the Environment Division of the Ministry of Climate Resilience. And in Grenada, we have many coastal challenges. In the last 10 years, we've seen influxes of sargassum, which has been a challenge to remove from the coastal zones and beaches, which are major tourism attractions. Ongoing coastal erosion around the island, sometimes exacerbated by sand mining, as you can see in the top right-hand side. We're seeing loss of cultural heritage in the coastal zones. In the bottom left-hand corner, we can see loss of a coastal cemetery to the sea in the sister island of Petit in Carriacou. And in the bottom right-hand side, we can see an example from Petit Martinique, where people are really trying to protect the coastline and their properties on their own, sometimes building ad hoc coastal engineering or structures out of conch shells or local building material. We also have many coastal hazards in Grenada, hurricanes, storm surge, coastal flooding. Because of the presence of an undersea volcano to the north of the island, we're actually susceptible to tsunamis as well. And then we have to take into account future sea level rise. This is just an example of a hurricane. We had a direct hit from Hurricane Ivan in 2004. This led to damages of over 200% of our GDP. Here we can see the National Stadium, which was destroyed at the time. Unfortunately, we had a second hurricane hit us not long after Hurricane Ivan, Hurricane Emily, and that again had additional impacts, left our agricultural sector in ruins and the tourism sector as well. And an interesting fact which came out of an OECS report was that many coastal ecosystems were not able to recover in between the periods of those two hurricanes to provide any kind of buffering effect, especially coastal forests. In Grenada, as I mentioned, we have many coastal intact ecosystems. So we have seagrass beds, coral reefs, and mangroves. And these all provide wave attenuation effects. So my research is really going to be looking at the protective value of these ecosystems in terms of storm surge and sea level rise are the main ones we're looking at. Just to give an impact of a visualization of how these ecosystems protect our shoreline. They are all able to attenuate waves, so buffer incoming waves and storm surge. In particular, coral reef and mangroves, due to their fixed nature and rigid habitat. Seagrass beds and coral reefs and coastal forests also play important roles as well. Seagrass beds to a lesser role, but they're very important in terms of sediment stabilization. Despite the fact that we have a number of coastal ecosystems in Grenada, there's a major challenge in terms of development. So where we have the most sensitive areas are also the areas which are targeted the most for development. This includes an area to the south here, which is actually a protected bird sanctuary for one of the most endangered birds in the world, the Grenada dove. In 2017, you can see, even though we have a protected Ramsar site to the north of the island under the International Wetlands Convention, this hasn't deterred development from happening there. And just this year, we actually lost an area of mangrove in the southeast of the country as well due to development. So my proposed intervention is to look at developing guidance for coastal zone management in Grenada by monitoring ecosystems and beaches using drones, and then also modeling the value of coastal ecosystems in terms of reducing coastal vulnerability. Just very quickly, in my past role as a coastal zone officer in the Ministry of Climate Resilience, I was assisting with the development of an integrated coastal zone policy for Grenada. This actually passed in 2015 and developed a sort of a delineation of the coastal zone management area for Grenada. provided a framework for coastal zone management, and really laid out the need for protection of coastal ecosystems and activities such as sand mining and dumping around the coastal zone as well. From that, we were looking at supporting legislation, developing supporting legislation. And when I returned to the island in 2019, we'd actually passed the Integrated Coastal Zone Management Bill as well. The study and the legislation has actually been supported very recently by high-resolution data collection. We recently had bathymetric and terrestrial LiDAR taken into 2 different projects. And for the first time, we actually had a sediment transport and shoreline change study done for the whole island to understand how our beaches are changing and coastal processes around the island. So I've really been trying to build on these studies in terms of my own work. So I'm going to go through the process I did in terms of modeling coastal vulnerability in Grenada using the INVEST tool developed by the Natural Capital Project. And I was really interested in using this tool because of the recent work I've done in Belize in terms of developing coastal zone management plans, and in the Bahamas for developing sustainable development plans. So I'm just going to quickly go into the types of inputs which go into the model. So as I mentioned, the high-resolution digital elevation data, which was produced for Grenada recently, went into this model in terms of providing relief around the whole coastline, so understanding where the coastline is low-lying, where we have high elevation areas. I'm using ecosystem GIS layers from the Nature Conservancy, so showing us where we have coral reef, mangrove, and seagrass layers around the country. I'm also using the coastal forest layer from the World Bank as well. The model pulls in WaveWatch 3 data, which is global wind and wave data sets. I'm using the WorldPop database to pull in population data sets. A sea level rise scenario using data from nearby Trinidad. This is because Grenada doesn't have a long time series of data in terms of a tidal gauge. So I'm using data from the nearby islands. And a major input for this model is a geomorphology classification for the coastline. And I use geomorphology here in a very broad sense because it's a very broad classification of whether the shoreline is made up of beach, mud, whether you have hard structures like coastal engineering, high and low cliffs, etc. And all of this feeds into this table here. The model basically computes a physical exposure index by combining the ranks of these biological and physical variables into using the geometric mean. So very, very quickly, we can see a low vulnerability or low exposure where we have high cliffs, where we have multiple ecosystems present, such as coral reef and mangroves, versus where we have no habitat or we have very low-lying sandy beaches. Is one sort of very easy example. Another important parameter for the model is habitat protection distance. So this is the distance where the model actually looks for coastal ecosystems around the country. And this plays into the role that they're, like for example, for coral reefs, how far away can they be present and still attenuate waves? Just to give you a visualization of how this looks, this is an eastern portion of the coastline from Grenada. So digitizing it, we can see where we have beaches in yellow, we have cliffs in red, for example. Overlaid that, we'll see where our ecosystems are actually present. So we can see seagrass in yellow, mangrove in green, and in orange we have our dune habitat. And then on top of that, the global wave data sets are sort of, all this information is aggregated into these data points, which are the red and yellow points at the bottom, called shore points in the model. And that's what I really use to visualize the data around the whole country. An important thing to note here is that the model is not taking into account the effects of nearshore ecosystems in terms of modeling nearshore waves. So it's mainly global waves, offshore waves, which are being modeled. I'm just going to focus on a couple areas. I'm going to look at one of the most populated areas in the south of the country, Grenada, a number of important ecosystem areas in the north in terms of Leverett, Bosway, and Sautères, and a quick examples of what the model is showing from Carriacou and Petit Martinique. Here is the south of the island, St. George's, and if we look at the sort of middle here, we can see Grand Anse, which is one of the most popular beaches in the entire country, and where we have a huge majority of hotel infrastructure. And you can see under current conditions with current levels of habitat, so we can see the pink is the coral reef, yellow is seagrass, light green is mangroves, and the blue area is the coastal forest. You can see that the beach is showing a medium exposure ranking. If we were to remove all habitat, we can see that things start to slowly become the exposure rankings become much higher. So certain parts of the beach start to turn from orange to red. And if we were to layer sea level rise on top of that, then the vast majority of beaches and low-lying areas become very highly exposed. This includes the south of the peninsula here, which has our international airport as well. If you to move to the north of the country, so this area, green area here is where we have the internationally protected Ramsar site. And we can see, I also tried to take into account other things which could be affecting exposure and wave processes around the coast. So we have some small barrier islands here, and there will be wave refraction in these areas too, which would have an impact. If we were to remove the habitats from these areas again, we can see all the major beaches here and the town of Sateres as well here are all going to be much more highly exposed. Just jump into Carriacou and Petit Martinique, our sister islands. So again, showing with habitat here, under present conditions, some of these areas are already at very high exposure ranking. This is mainly because of the wave exposure is much higher in these areas because this side of the country is much more exposed to the Atlantic Ocean versus the leeward side of the island, which is exposed more to the Caribbean Sea. So the small red area in the middle is actually the area I showed you, which has the cemetery, which has already been lost to the sea. An important sort of factor when I was doing the study as well is understanding that the existing layers here are not showing some of the intricacies of the coast in terms of some of the smaller nearshore ecosystems. If I quickly look at Petit Martinique here, we can see very uniform seagrass areas and coral reefs, when in reality, there are going to be smaller reefs around the island as well, fringing reefs. And again, without this habitat here, the vast majority of the coast becomes much more highly exposed. Another important sort of metric I pulled out is the habitat role. So where habitats are having the largest impact in terms of reducing coastal vulnerability. And a very quick look at this looks like for mainland Grenada, the vast majority of the windward side of the island is where the ecosystems are having the greatest impact. And for Carriacou, it's actually a mix of both sides as well, including the main town here, where there's a large extent of mangroves. So my main deliverable for this component of the project is to deliver an assessment of the entire country in terms of where these ecosystems are having the greatest impact. And I'm hoping that this valuation will be really important for future coastal zone management and other ongoing synergistic studies, which I'll touch on a little bit later. The second component of what I wanted to work on, again, looking at the framework of coastal zone management and needed to have updated data sets on coastal ecosystems and on coastal processes such as beach accretion and erosion, is I wanted to really look at data collection in terms of using drones and photogrammetry for monitoring these ecosystems and our beaches. So very quickly, photogrammetry is sort of the art and science of extracting 3D information from photographs. This is done by taking overlapping imagery with the drones and creating surfaces or structures such as digital elevation models. So around the country, I was actually sort of had to teach myself how to use high resolution GPS equipment, how to use drones and the software and analysis software related to using this methodology. And I basically piloted the use of this method on 5 beaches in Grenada. I was hoping to actually do more, but we had restrictions to do with COVID as well. And again, this is linked to the need for monitoring of coastal erosion as well. We can see here we have extreme erosion going on in the north of the island, and in fact, coastal engineering has already been built here, but that's resulted in one area of the town being protected, where this area is eroding at a rapid rate. And actually, archaeological remains are actually being covered here in terms of Amerindian burial grounds because of the extent of the erosion. So with the products from the drone surveys, I can create high-resolution digital elevation models, which allow me to calculate volumes for the entire beaches as well as pull profiles to understand how the beach is changing. And when conditions are ideal, such as on Pandy Beach here, and you have very little turbidity and good penetration into the water, you can actually get bathymetric data as well. And you can also get information on the vegetation in the nearshore areas too. Just an example of a profile from one of the beaches. And this sort of is able to augment the older methods which we're using right now. which are sort of limited by not being attached to any sort of GIS, and is a very sort of ad hoc data set of lots of changes of different equipment. There's no sort of like standard method of monitoring the beaches here. So for this deliverable, I'm hoping to produce a manuscript which will be produce guidelines for continuing this monitoring around the country. So just moving to my recommendations. Grenada has collected a lot of high resolution data recently, so it's really important to mobilize that in terms of understanding of coastal processes, in terms of understanding, for example, where our ecosystems are and where they're having the most effect. Coastal monitoring and continual monitoring of coastal ecosystems is going to be really vital to assessing their value and preventing their loss. And I'm hoping that the drone surveys will be an important tool there. Community input will be really a key component of this as well. The model that I demonstrated, the INVEST tool, is actually a qualitative model. As I mentioned, it's limited in terms of the nearshore area, in terms of modeling wave and wave interactions with the coast in the nearshore area. But I think combining this with the quantitative studies which have been done recently in Grenada really helps provide an important data set in terms of informing coastal zone management. And although it wasn't really a focus of my study, cultural and socio-ecological data will be very important to highlight local usages of ecosystems and really help to assess their additional benefits, because I'm only looking at one particular benefit of these ecosystems, which is the habitat protection value. So throughout my capstone process, I've had the good luck, I guess, or fortune to interface a number of different ongoing projects in Grenada. One which was a marine spatial planning project. So I was able to interface directly with the consultants in terms of data collection to go into that project. And I think my work here and the studies will be able to feed into that. There's a national ecosystem assessment project which is ongoing, which is linked to the global IP-BESS assessment. And again, I think the outputs of my models will be able to feed into that study, which is going to end up in a report for terrestrial and coastal ecosystems in Grenada. I was also able to, this wasn't really planned, but the Center for the Environment, Fisheries, and Aquaculture Sciences were building off of a study done with the shoreline change assessment for Grenada in terms of a coastal economic vulnerability assessment. And I was actually asked to contribute to that. And that was a great learning experience, and that should actually be published or submitted for publication towards the end of the month. So the next steps, as I mentioned, is to aggregate all these different data sets in terms of moving towards a coastal zone management plan for Grenada. I mentioned that we passed legislation recently, but the problem is the legislation calls for a coastal zone management area in order to enforce large parts of that bill. So having this bill is sort of vital for enforcement and monitoring in a holistic way around the coast. And just very briefly, my sort of vision for doing this is looking at how other islands such as Jamaica and Seychelles have developed coastal zone management plans using high resolution data and really looking at small geomorphological units around the coastline in terms of understanding how the coastline is changing, what the coastal vulnerability is, and really informing sustainable development. So I'd like to thank everybody who's helping with this, especially the team at the Natural Capital Project who developed the INVEST tool. That's Dr. Katie Arkema, Jess Silver, and they really allowed me to interact with the other ongoing projects they're working on with the Inter-American Development Bank in the Mesoamerican Reef area and throughout the Caribbean. I'd like to thank the Environment Division and Land Use Division of the Government of Grenada, who allowed me access to the high-resolution data and studies such as the shoreline change assessment, the Nature Conservancy for providing me with data sets on ecosystems around Grenada, my faculty and advisors of the TFP program, including Dr. Bohar Reguero, who really put a lot of time and effort into assisting me with this and sharing his network and knowledge. Dr. Gary Griggs, who was really instrumental in helping with some of my earlier work, including working with the city of Santa Cruz over the summer on coastal adaptation strategies reviews. And then Dr. Ann Kapuczynski and Sarah Emmenheiser as a director and assistant director, and all the other faculty, my colleagues, friends, and family as well. And I just have my email at the bottom. Thank you very much.